Margaret Maggie Chen stood on the tarmac of the military base, the heat of the midday sun pressing down on her like a weight. She wore a bright orange reflective vest, blending into the background of the busy airfield as planes taxied, officers hurried past, and technicians moved from one task to the next. She had no rank insignia, no special title, just a civilian contractor assigned to perimeter security, a job that most of her colleagues took for granted and dismissed. At 42, Maggie had seen it all. Her past was a tightly guarded secret, her identity erased, her presence ignored by everyone around her. But today, something felt different. The base had received word of an incoming VIP, a four-star general whose visit was rare, especially to a logistics base like this one. Maggie's position, far from the landing zone, seemed insignificant, but as she stood there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She wasn't just standing watch over an airfield today, she was guarding something much more important, something no one else would ever recognize. A young officer passed by her, shouting a teasing remark, but Maggie didn't react. She had long ago learned to blend into the background. It was safer that way. But her training, the vigilance instilled in her during years of military service, kept her focused on the task at hand. Her eyes scanned the area, observing the routine, the small details, the things others would overlook. That was when she saw it, an unauthorized vehicle approaching Hangar 7, a maintenance vehicle with no clearance. Maggie's instincts kicked in. Her hand moved toward the radio, her voice calm and controlled. Possible security breach at Hangar 7. Unauthorized vehicle approaching. Over. The radio crackled, the voice of her supervisor, Staff Sergeant Jenkins, coming through immediately. Stand down, Chen. It's scheduled maintenance. Maggie hesitated. Something didn't feel right. She kept her eyes trained on the vehicle as it moved closer to the restricted area. Her instincts told her that something was wrong. It wasn't just another routine check. Something was off. She couldn't explain it, but her gut was never wrong. Minutes later, the situation confirmed her suspicion. Jenkins rushed to intercept the vehicle, pulling the driver aside for questioning. A potential breach had been stopped, but Maggie knew that the real test was yet to come. As the sun began to set and her shift continued, she couldn't shake the feeling that today was different. The general would arrive soon, and with him, things on the base were about to change forever. The next few hours passed in a blur of routine for Maggie. Security personnel scurried around, preparing for the arrival of General Hayes. The base was buzzing with anticipation. A few officers exchanged jokes, while others pretended to busy themselves, adjusting uniforms or pretending to review protocols. Maggie, however, remained focused. Her eyes never stopped scanning the perimeter, never stopped searching for anything out of the ordinary. It was just what she did. As the VIP arrival time neared, her radio crackled again. All security positions at heightened alert. General Hayes arriving at 1800 hours. All personnel report to your designated positions. Maggie barely glanced up as she keyed in her response. Checkpoint 7 standing by. It was the same routine, nothing different, just a VIP visitor, but Maggie could feel the tension in the air, the weight of expectation hanging over the base. General Hayes wasn't just any visitor. His reputation preceded him. The man who had seen combat, who had lived through horrors most could only imagine. He was a symbol of power, of control, of order. And Maggie? She was just the woman on the edge of the action. Assigned to a remote corner of the base, far from the important events, as always. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows over the tarmac, as Maggie stood motionless. She was invisible, just as she had always been. But today, as the convoy approached the base, something stirred deep within her. She had been part of a world where nothing was what it seemed. A world where heroes were made and unmade in the blink of an eye. And she couldn't ignore the nagging sense that today something would happen that would bring her past back into the light. As the convoy of SUVs entered the base, Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't explain it, but the moment she saw the vehicles approach, her thoughts turned back to a time long buried in her memory. She tried to push it away, focus on the task at hand, but there was no denying it. The general was here, and with him, a flood of memories she had long tried to forget. Maggie stayed still, her posture perfect, eyes scanning the area around her. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. The convoy came to a halt, and the first person to step out was none other than General Hayes. His silver hair gleamed in the sunlight, his uniform immaculate. He walked with the confidence of someone who had lived through battles and emerged victorious. His eyes swept across the base, sharp and assessing, before they landed on Maggie. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance. Maggie held his gaze, unmoving. As he glanced at her, she could see the flicker of recognition, the brief flash of something unspoken. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. He turned his attention back to the base commanders, but Maggie remained frozen, the weight of his gaze lingering in her mind. She tried to ignore the flutter in her chest, but it was impossible. This man, this general, was someone from her past, someone she had saved, and now their worlds were colliding once more. As the general moved on to greet other officers, Maggie's pulse quickened. She knew it wasn't just chance that had brought him here. There was something more, something bigger happening. She had no proof, no concrete evidence, but the sense that this was the beginning of something important, something dangerous, was unmistakable. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Maggie didn't let her guard down, didn't allow herself to slip into the comfortable routine of being invisible. Something was coming, something she could feel in her bones. And as she watched the general move about the base, she knew that this encounter, this meeting, would change everything. The following day, the airbase buzzed with an even greater sense of urgency. General Hayes had requested a full security inspection, and with it came the unspoken pressure to prove the base's reliability. The entire security team had been placed on high alert, and every checkpoint, including Maggie's, was meticulously reviewed. As the briefing began, Chief Daniels stood before the team, his face tense. "This isn't a drill, people. The general's reputation is on the line. We need to be perfect." Maggie stood silently among her colleagues, her posture impeccable. Her assignment remained unchanged. Checkpoint 7, far from the main action. But as she listened to the briefing, something in her gut told her that today would be different. She couldn't quite explain it, but she knew that her part in the day's events was about to shift. She had always been good at reading situations, at sensing when things were about to go wrong. The base was quieter than usual this morning, a few staff officers exchanging tense glances. The general's inspection was no longer a formality. This was something more, a test. Maggie could feel it in the air. As the day wore on, she moved through her routine. The weather was unbearably hot, and the sun beat down relentlessly on the tarmac. She took a sip of water from her bottle, her eyes scanning the horizon. The maintenance workers from the previous day were nowhere to be seen. But Maggie's mind remained alert, vigilant. She continued to monitor her sector, knowing that her position, though far from the action, allowed her to observe everything without being seen. As the general's convoy moved toward the perimeter of the base, Maggie's focus intensified. She had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary, yet every fiber of her being was attuned to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. A truck passed by, a maintenance vehicle with an unmarked license plate. Maggie's eyes narrowed. She hadn't seen that vehicle before. Her instincts screamed at her to investigate. She keyed her radio. "Possible security breach at checkpoint 6. Unknown vehicle. Over." The reply came through almost immediately. "Stand down, Chen. It's routine." But Maggie wasn't convinced. She watched the truck move past, the driver's nervous glances not escaping her trained eye. Something wasn't right. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, even if they made her unpopular with her peers. As the convoy approached checkpoint 7, Maggie remained at her post. The general's vehicle slowed as it passed her position, and for a fleeting moment, Maggie found herself staring into the eyes of the man who had once been rescued by her team. A brief moment of recognition flickered between them, though neither of them acknowledged it. The general's gaze shifted away as his convoy continued on, but Maggie's thoughts remained fixed on him. She could feel the weight of his presence, the unspoken history between them, but for now she had a job to do. The inspection continued. Maggie remained focused, her attention shifting between her sector and the convoy's progress along the base perimeter. The general was inspecting every position, checking every detail. Her own section remained untouched by his scrutiny, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. As the convoy moved further down the perimeter, Maggie noticed an unusual figure standing near the edge of the base. A civilian wearing a maintenance jacket, but with no clear identification. Maggie's instincts flared once again. She keyed her radio. "Unknown individual near perimeter, no proper ID, over." The response was quick, but Maggie's gut told her that this wasn't an ordinary situation. Something was happening here, and the general's visit was no coincidence. It was all connected. Maggie's mind raced as she kept her gaze fixed on the figure. The general's inspection was still ongoing, but her attention was fully focused on the potential threat. She didn't need to wait for confirmation. She knew what she had to do. Without hesitation, she began to move toward the figure, her mind calculating her next steps. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time in years, Maggie felt a surge of adrenaline. She was no longer just a forgotten security officer. She was on the brink of uncovering something much bigger, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Maggie moved quickly, her boots silent on the hot pavement as she approached the figure standing near the perimeter. The man seemed unaware of her approach, his back turned as he fiddled with something near the fence. His nervous glances, however, did not go unnoticed. Maggie's instincts screamed at her to close the distance. Every step she took was deliberate, each movement calculated. She had no doubt in her mind that this man was up to something. As she reached a position just out of sight, Maggie paused. She scanned the area, ensuring no one else was watching, and then, without a sound, she moved closer. The man was still focused on the fence, but the lack of proper identification and the way he avoided the usual routes sent warning bells ringing in Maggie's mind. She stepped closer, her voice steady as she called out, "Sir, can I help you with something?" The man froze, his body stiffening at the sound of her voice. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze with a nervous smile. "I'm just checking something for maintenance," he said, his voice unconvincing. Maggie didn't buy it. "Do you have clearance?" she asked, her tone colder now. He hesitated, his eyes darting around. I don't have the paperwork, but I was told to." Before he could finish, Maggie cut him off. "I'll need to see your ID and clearance papers," she said firmly, stepping closer. The man's nervousness only deepened. "Look, I'm just doing my job. No need to make a scene." Maggie wasn't having it. She reached for her radio, calling in the situation. "Security, I have an unauthorized individual near the perimeter. No clearance papers. Over." Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. The man's face paled as he glanced at her, then quickly down at the ground. He started to back away, but Maggie stepped forward, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady and cold. "You're coming with me." A flicker of panic crossed his face. Maggie had seen it before. People like him didn't panic unless they had something to hide. He reached into his pocket as though to pull out a phone, but Maggie was faster. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it just enough to disarm him, and with a sharp tug, pulled him into a nearby security checkpoint. "You're going to explain yourself," she said, her grip unyielding. As she pushed the man into the checkpoint, Maggie's heart raced, not from fear, but from anticipation. She had always known this day would come, the day when she would have to confront her past and her skills once more. What she hadn't expected was the personal connection that had come with it. The general's visit wasn't just about security, it was a test, and Maggie had passed it. The man's story crumbled as soon as he was questioned. He was a plant, someone sent to infiltrate the base and retrieve sensitive information. Maggie's suspicions were correct. The general was right to bring her in. As the man was taken into custody, Maggie remained silent, her mind already racing to the next step. She had uncovered the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Her role in this story wasn't over. It had just begun. The next hours felt like a blur to Maggie. After the unauthorized individual had been taken into custody, she returned to her post, though her thoughts were far from routine security work. The general's presence was no longer a distant formality. It was now something personal, something she couldn't ignore. The information she had uncovered, the surveillance device, the unauthorized worker, it all pointed to something far bigger than a simple security breach. Maggie's mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard about the intelligence leak. The general had known more than he let on, and that fact alone unsettled her. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the base, Maggie found herself in the quiet solitude of her checkpoint. The day's events were unfolding in ways she couldn't have predicted. The general's inspection continued, and every moment, every decision he made seemed to be part of a larger plan, one that involved her more than she was comfortable with. Her shift was nearing its end when she received a message over the radio. "Chen, report to the command building. You're being reassigned for the evening." Maggie's first instinct was to refuse. She was only a perimeter guard, and as far as she knew, she wasn't meant to be involved in anything more than routine security. But the general's earlier comments echoed in her mind. "I'm staying in the VIP quarters tonight. I suspect that won't be a problem for you." The words hung in her mind like a challenge. Maggie knew it was no longer just about securing the base. It was about something far deeper. She couldn't ignore the pull to be part of something bigger, something that would finally give her the purpose she'd been searching for after years of being sidelined. She knew she had to go. When she arrived at the command building, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Officers hurried past, their faces grim, carrying folders marked with high-level security clearances. Maggie was led to the East Corridor, a quiet, almost forgotten part of the building. As she stood there, the minutes dragging by, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had been invisible for so long, relegated to the edges of the action, but now she was at the center of something that could change everything. The command building seemed to hum with a nervous energy as Maggie stood silently in her assigned spot. The clock ticked relentlessly toward 2200 hours. As she surveyed the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was going to happen tonight. And sure enough, just as the hour approached, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Maggie's heart skipped a beat as the familiar figure of General Hayes emerged from the shadows. This time, there was no formal greeting, no briefing. He simply nodded to her and walked past, his presence commanding. Maggie followed silently, her mind racing with possibilities. The general led her down the hall, and as they neared the VIP quarters, he glanced over at her. "I need you to be ready," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "There's something we need to discuss, something that could change the way you see this whole operation." Maggie felt a pang of uncertainty, but it was overshadowed by the overwhelming sense that she was about to step into a world she had long been shut out of. As they entered the quarters, the door closing behind them, Maggie's pulse quickened. She had crossed the line from being a background observer to someone whose actions would shape the outcome of what was to come. The general turned to face her, his expression serious. "I need your help, Captain Chen. This isn't just about a leak anymore. It's about identifying who's behind it and stopping them before it's too late." Maggie's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. She had been a ghost for so long, but now, standing before the man whose life she had once saved, she was finally about to confront the demons of her past. And in doing so, she would help uncover a threat that could shake the very foundations of everything she had ever known. The weight of the general's words hung heavily in the air, thick with the promise of something more than Maggie had expected. She stood still, absorbing the gravity of the situation. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something resembling hope. Not for her own sake, but for the mission that had defined her life in the past. The general's eyes were unwavering as he looked at her, his face drawn with the same intensity she remembered from their time in the field. "I need to know everything you remember, Captain," he said quietly. "Everything from Operation Shadowfall. What happened after your team extracted me?" Maggie's throat tightened. She hadn't spoken about that mission in years. The pain of losing her team, the betrayal by those who had abandoned them, still gnawed at her. But the general was right. This wasn't just a question of past mistakes. It was a matter of national security. She met his gaze, nodding slowly. "After the extraction, we were separated. The mission was deemed too sensitive, too risky. They told me the team was dead, lost when the helicopter was shot down during extraction. But that wasn't the truth." The general's expression hardened as he stepped closer. "And you weren't the only one left behind. You and your team were erased, Maggie. And now, years later, someone is using that operation to leak sensitive information. I need to know who." Maggie's mind raced as memories flooded back. Her team had been split up, placed under different identities, their existence wiped from official records. They had been left to fend for themselves, cast aside like expendable assets. She had survived, but at what cost? The weight of the secrecy, the lies, it was almost too much to bear. But Maggie had always known how to keep moving, how to push through the darkest moments. She turned to face the general, her voice steady. "The surveillance device I found earlier, it's connected. Someone's using this base to gather intel, and they're tied to people from my past. I don't know who they are, but I can't shake the feeling that they're watching us." The general's gaze sharpened, his jaw tightening. "Then we're going to find out who's behind this, Captain, and we're going to stop them." Maggie nodded, her resolve firming. She had been invisible for so long, but now she was stepping back into the light. She wasn't just an observer anymore, she was an active participant in something bigger than herself. The general's voice broke through her thoughts. "We'll start with the personnel files. We need to see if any of your former team members are still here. If they are, we'll have to be careful. We don't know how deep this goes." Maggie's mind was already working through the possibilities. She had once been part of a covert operation, a mission no one was supposed to know about, but the pieces were falling into place now. The general was right. The operation hadn't ended. It had simply evolved, and they were both still part of it. As Maggie prepared to leave the VIP quarters with the general, her mind shifted to the task ahead. There was no going back now. She was already involved, already committed, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose. The mission wasn't over. Not yet. The next day unfolded with a cold efficiency that felt both familiar and foreign to Maggie. The general's plan was taking shape, and with it came the tension of working in the shadows once again. They were about to dig into something much bigger than they'd anticipated, but the first step was clear: finding out who was still operating under false identities and what their role was in the larger scheme. Maggie had always excelled at covert operations, at blending into the background and gathering the crucial details that no one else noticed. Now, with the general at her side, they were about to turn the tables on the very system that had tried to bury them. She moved through the base quietly, her steps purposeful, as she approached the security office to request access to the personnel files. She couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, the weight of the task ahead bearing down on her. If her former team was still scattered across this base under false names, they were likely living in a world of constant fear, cut off from everything they had once known. The security officer at the desk gave her a nod as she approached, recognizing her from the previous day. "Chen," he said with a hint of surprise, "what can I do for you?" Maggie didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to access the personnel files, specifically anyone who has been stationed here with prior military service." The officer glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "That's a tall order, Chen. I can put in a request, but you know the procedure." Maggie didn't flinch. She had already prepared herself for resistance. She had dealt with far worse during her covert days. "I have authorization from General Hayes," she said, her voice steady. The officer looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, give me a minute." Maggie waited, her mind running through the possibilities. If anyone from her team was still on the base, they had to be in deep cover. She couldn't afford to waste any time. The officer returned moments later with a stack of folders. "Here are the files you requested, but you'd better make it quick. We've got a lot of personnel to keep track of today." Maggie nodded and took the files from him, her fingers brushing against the cold paper. As she flipped through the pages, her heart began to race. The names were a blur at first, but then she saw it. A familiar name, one she hadn't thought about in years, a member of her old team, stationed under a new identity. "This is it," she muttered under her breath. "I knew it." The general's voice crackled through her earpiece. "What have you found, Captain?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "I've found one of my team members. He's stationed here under a different name. I'm going to need backup." The general's response was immediate. "Stay there, Maggie. We're on our way." Maggie knew the stakes had just been raised. If one of her team members was here, it meant others could be as well. The question now was what they had been doing on this base all these years. She couldn't afford to waste time. She quickly gathered the files and prepared to leave the security office. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Had they been operating under the radar all this time, gathering intelligence, or had they been manipulated into something far darker? The answers were just out of reach, but Maggie was determined to find them. She couldn't let the past continue to haunt her team, and she certainly wouldn't allow it to jeopardize national security. As she moved swiftly through the hallways, her mind began to piece together the larger picture. The surveillance device she had found earlier was only the beginning. There was something bigger at play here, something that was tied to her team, to the mission they had completed, and to the life they had been forced to leave behind. The general's arrival was imminent, but Maggie wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She was already moving forward, taking the steps that would uncover the truth, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The atmosphere inside the security office was tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Maggie stood over the personnel files, the stack of documents heavy in her hands. Her thoughts raced faster than she could keep up with. The name she had just uncovered was like a ghost from her past, one she had never fully believed she would encounter again. It was impossible, yet there it was, staring back at her from the page. A member of her team, alive and well, serving under a completely new identity. It confirmed her deepest fears. If he was here, others were bound to be too. She had always known that the system had buried them, erased them, but to find them operating so close to the heart of this base was a revelation she wasn't prepared for. As Maggie prepared to leave the security office, she turned the corner and almost collided with Colonel Richards. His sharp gaze scanned her, eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of the files in her hand. "Officer Chen, what's this?" Maggie didn't flinch. She had come this far, she wasn't going to be intimidated. "Routine check, sir. I'm following up on a lead." Richards didn't ask further questions. There was something in her tone that made him hesitate before nodding curtly. "You're sure about this, Chen?" Maggie met his eyes, her expression calm but determined. "Yes, sir." She moved past him, her mind still on the file she had just uncovered. As soon as she was outside, she keyed her radio. "General Hayes, I've found one of them, a former team member. I'm heading to the south perimeter now." The response came quickly. "Understood. We're en route. Don't engage yet, Maggie. Stay where you are." But Maggie's resolve was already firming. She had lived through too much not to act when she had the chance. If this was the lead she had been waiting for, she couldn't let it slip away. She couldn't let more lives be put at risk because of her hesitance. The general was right. This wasn't about official procedures anymore. It was about stopping a far-reaching threat that had been buried in plain sight. Maggie moved swiftly, making her way toward the south perimeter of the base. Her mind was sharp, calculating every move. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The base was more than just a military installation now. It was the center of an operation that spanned far beyond the intelligence leaks she had been briefed on. The further she got from the main building, the more her senses heightened. She could feel eyes on her, though she couldn't tell from where. The feeling of being watched had become second nature to her. It was part of the job, part of the life she had left behind. She had once been a ghost in the military system, and now, once again, she was moving unnoticed among the shadows. Maggie's pace quickened as she reached the designated area. Her eyes swept over the distant buildings, scanning for anything unusual. In the distance, she saw a figure moving between the storage containers. She froze. Was this her contact? Was it another member of her team, or had she stumbled upon something else entirely? She waited, every muscle tense, her hand resting on the radio. She didn't make a move until the figure disappeared behind a building. Only then did she activate her radio, her voice steady. "General Hayes, I have visual on the subject, moving in." The response was immediate. "Stay cautious, Maggie. We'll be there soon. Don't take unnecessary risks." Maggie acknowledged the order, but she wasn't one to sit back when she had the opportunity to act. Her training kicked in, and she moved forward silent as a shadow. As she closed the distance, the questions kept coming. Who was this person? What was their role in the larger operation? And most importantly, was her team still being used in ways they hadn't agreed to? Maggie didn't know yet, but she was about to find out. Maggie moved with the precision of someone who had spent years operating behind enemy lines. Her every step was calculated, every sound drowned out by the adrenaline that rushed through her veins. She could feel the heat of the day still clinging to the air, the buzzing of distant activity on the base serving as a background hum that made the silence around her all the more intense. She kept her eyes trained on the figure moving between the storage containers, the person she had seen earlier. They were walking in a straight line, not hurried but deliberate, as if they knew exactly where they were headed. Maggie's pulse quickened. Her instincts told her this was no ordinary base worker. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something about the way they moved, the careful glances they cast around the perimeter, struck her as off. She had been in situations like this before, where the smallest details were the most telling. She moved faster now, slipping between buildings to close the distance. She had to get closer, had to confirm if this was the lead she had been waiting for. As she neared the storage containers, she took a quick glance over her shoulder. She couldn't afford to be seen, couldn't risk alerting anyone to her presence. The figure was still ahead, now closer to the entrance of a hangar. Maggie pushed forward, her breath steady but her heart pounding in her chest. The world around her felt smaller now, as though all that existed was her and this person. Just a few more steps. Her hand instinctively brushed against the radio, but she hesitated. She didn't want to alert the general yet. Not until she had a clearer picture. Not until she knew what she was dealing with. Then, just as she was about to take another step, the figure turned sharply, and their eyes locked for a split second. Maggie froze. The person's expression flickered, the recognition clear, before they quickly masked it. Maggie's mind raced. Was this one of her team members, or someone working with them? Before she could react, the person vanished behind the corner of the hangar. Maggie took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She had seen enough to know that this wasn't just a casual mistake. Whoever this was, they were hiding something. She followed, maintaining the distance between them. Her hand tightened around the radio. "General Hayes," she whispered into the mic, her voice barely audible, "I've located a suspect. Moving to intercept." The response crackled through immediately. "Wait for backup, Maggie. I'm almost there." But Maggie wasn't waiting. She couldn't afford to. She had seen that flicker of recognition, and it told her everything she needed to know. This person was involved, and Maggie was going to find out how. She quickened her pace, rounding the corner of the hangar just in time to see the figure slip through a side door. Maggie's mind raced. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. She was no longer just observing. She was actively part of the operation, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. Without another thought, she moved toward the door, ready to confront whatever lay inside. Maggie's hand hovered over the door handle, her breath steady despite the quickening beat of her heart. The dim light spilling from the crack beneath the door cast shadows on the walls, making the space feel smaller, more claustrophobic. She knew she was about to cross a line, stepping deeper into an operation that was already far more complicated than she had ever expected. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open, slipping into the darkness beyond. The air inside was thick with the smell of metal and oil, a stark contrast to the sun-baked air outside. The hangar was vast, rows of old equipment lining the walls. But it was the figure standing near the back that caught her attention. They were not alone. A second person stood across the room, hidden in the shadows, watching her every move. Maggie's pulse surged. She didn't need to make any sudden moves. She had learned long ago to be patient, to observe before acting. "I've been waiting for you," the first figure said, their voice low and calm. Maggie's hand tightened around the radio, but she didn't speak. Instead, she observed them carefully, waiting for the truth to surface. The figure stepped forward, and as they did, their face emerged from the shadows. Maggie's breath caught. She knew this person, not from the past she had buried, but from the present, from the files she had uncovered just hours ago. It was one of her former teammates, someone she hadn't seen in years, someone she thought had been lost forever. "I see you're still playing the ghost, Maggie," the figure said, a smirk playing on their lips. "Still hiding in plain sight." Maggie didn't flinch. Her hand remained steady at her side, though every fiber of her being screamed for action. She had questions, too many to count. But now wasn't the time. The general's words echoed in her mind. "We need to find out who's behind this." And here was the answer standing right in front of her. "What's going on here?" Maggie asked, her voice sharp and steady. "What have you been doing?" The figure chuckled softly. "Still the soldier, I see. The world changes, Maggie, but some things remain the same." Before Maggie could respond, the second figure stepped into view. The tension in the air thickened instantly. The face was unfamiliar, but their presence was unmistakable. They were a professional, someone with authority, someone who had orchestrated everything. "She's asking the right questions," the second figure said, their voice cold and calculating, "but the answers might cost you more than you're willing to pay." Maggie's mind raced. This was bigger than just a leak. This was an operation, one that involved her team and, by extension, the very security of everything she had once sworn to protect. She couldn't go back to being the invisible ghost she had been. Not anymore. The general would have her back soon, but for now it was up to her to uncover the truth. I don't have time for games, Maggie said, her voice calm but edged with authority. Tell me who's behind this. The first figure raised an eyebrow. You always were stubborn, Maggie. But if you want the truth, you're going to have to make a choice. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken history and hidden motives. Maggie didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The past she had thought was buried, the mission that had marked her life, was far from over. As the first figure took a step back, Maggie squared her shoulders, preparing for what came next. She was no longer a ghost. She was here to stay. Let's finish this, she said, and with that, everything changed.